There's a railway carriage, just an ordinary one, wooden, a little cramped, the kind of dining car that used to get hooked onto the back of a train. In November 1918, it was parked in a forest north of Paris, and inside it, a group of exhausted German officials signed a piece of paper that ended the First World War. Hold on to that image, because we're coming back to it. 22 years later, in June 1940, that exact same carriage got dragged out of a museum. Hitler personally ordered it. He had it towed back into the same forest, put on the same patch of ground, pointed in the same direction, and then he sat down in the same chair the French commander had sat in, and made France surrender to him. Same carriage, same clearing, opposite ends of the table. That's not a coincidence. That's not even really a symbol. That's the whole Second World War in one photograph. And it tells you something most people never quite absorb. This war was not a random catastrophe that fell out of the sky. It was the second half of an argument. So today, I want to try something a little insane. I want to tell you the entire Second World War, not one battle, not one general, the whole thing. How it actually started, how it actually got decided, and why the world you're sitting in right now is basically the settlement paperwork from it. Let's go. Okay. So first, you have to understand what 1918 did to people. The First World War killed something like 17 million people over 4 years for reasons that, if you ask most people to explain today, they genuinely cannot. And when it ended, the winners sat down at Versailles and wrote a treaty. And that treaty had a clause in it, Article 231, that made Germany legally accept responsibility for the entire war. Not partial responsibility, all of it. Attached to that was a bill, 132 billion gold marks. Now, was that fair? Honestly, historians still argue about it. France had been invaded twice in 50 years and had 1.5 million dead. They were not in a forgiving mood. But here's what matters, and it's the thing people miss. Fairness isn't really the point. What matters is how it felt to the people who had to live under it. And to a lot of Germans, it felt like being handed the bill for a fistfight you'd bled in. Then it got worse. In 1923, the German currency collapsed so completely that people burned banknotes for heat, because the paper was worth more as fuel than as money. Sit with that for a second. Your savings, your father's pension, not stolen, just evaporated. Things stabilized for a few years, and then 1929 happened. The Great Depression rolled across the world, and by 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. You know what happens to a country in that state? It stops asking who has the best policy. It starts asking who's angry at the same thing I'm angry at. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He didn't seize power in a coup. He was appointed, legally, by conservative politicians who were absolutely certain they could control him. That's one of those details that should keep you up at night. But here's where most tellings of this story go wrong, and I want to fix it early. The war didn't start in Europe. If you were Chinese, the Second World War started in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. Or in 1937, at a bridge outside Beijing, when it became a full open war and the city of Nanjing was subjected to weeks of massacre. If you were Ethiopian, it started in 1935, when Italy came with aircraft and mustard gas. Those weren't warm-up acts, that was the war. Millions of people were already dying in it while Europe was still calling the situation tension. So when someone tells you the war began on the 1st of September 1939, that's a European clock. Half the world's clock had been running for years. Now, let's talk about the thing everybody makes fun of, which I actually think is the saddest part of the whole story. Appeasement. Between 1936 and 1939, Hitler did a series of things that tore up the treaty. Remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed Austria, then demanded a chunk of Czechoslovakia. And every single time, Britain and France basically said, okay, fine, just this one. No more after this. In September 1938, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich, signed away that Czech territory, flew home, waved a piece of paper at a cheering crowd, and said the words that would follow him into every history book ever written: peace for our time. And it's easy to laugh at him. Everybody does. but I want you to sit in his chair for 1 second. Chamberlain was a man who had watched an entire generation of young men disappear into the mud of the Somme 20 years earlier. He wasn't a coward. He was a man doing anything, to avoid doing that again. Sometimes the most reasonable person in the room is wrong in the most expensive way possible. That's not a comfortable thought, is it? Then in August 1939 comes the twist nobody saw coming. And I mean nobody. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two states whose entire identities were built on hating each other, signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, we won't attack each other. Privately, in a secret protocol, they carved up Eastern Europe between them like a pizza. 9 days later, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war 2 days after that. And then, on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the other side. Poland held out about 5 weeks, fighting two of the largest armies on Earth coming from opposite directions. And then, nothing, for 8 months. The French sat behind their fortifications, the British shipped troops over, everybody waited. Newspapers called it the phony war. Soldiers got bored and played football. That was the calm. On the 10th of May, 1940, the German army came through the Ardennes forest. Now, the Ardennes was considered impassable for tanks, dense, hilly, narrow twisting roads. The French had built the Maginot Line, a genuinely incredible chain of underground fortresses along the German border, and left the Ardennes lightly held, because every serious military mind agreed you could not get an army through there. A German general named Erich von Manstein looked at that and thought, what if you could, though? So they did it. 7 armored divisions threading through forest roads in a traffic jam that stretched back over 100 miles. If anyone had bombed that column, this story ends differently. Nobody did. They came out the other side, crossed the River Meuse, and turned north, cutting the entire Allied army off from behind. Not by smashing through them, by walking around them and locking the door. And that's what blitzkrieg actually means, by the way. Everyone thinks it means fast tanks. It doesn't. It means don't destroy the enemy's army, destroy the enemy's ability to make decisions. Tanks and dive bombers and radios all moving faster than the other side's headquarters could think. The French army wasn't beaten because it was weak. On paper, it had more tanks. It was beaten because it kept fighting yesterday's battle, which left around 400,000 Allied soldiers backed up against the sea at a port called Dunkirk. You've probably heard this one. Over 9 days, 338,000 men were pulled off those beaches by destroyers, ferries, and hundreds of tiny civilian boats. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, people who just sailed across the channel because somebody asked them to. And I want to be honest, because this story gets romanticized a lot. Dunkirk was a disaster. They left behind essentially every tank, truck, and gun the British Army owned. It was a defeat. It's just that they saved the men, and the men turned out to be the part you can't replace. France signed its surrender on the 22nd of June, 1940. In that railway carriage, 6 weeks. That's all it took. So now it's the summer of 1940, and Britain is alone. And for the first time in history, a battle gets fought entirely in the sky. Germany needed control of the air before it could invade. So for 4 months, over southern England, a few thousand pilots went up 3, 4, 5 times a day until they were falling asleep in their cockpits between sorties. Here's the part that usually gets left out. Britain had radar, a chain of towers along the coast called Chain Home, feeding reports into central rooms where women of the Royal Air Force pushed markers across a giant map table. It was the world's first integrated air defense system. It meant the RAF never had to guess. They could send exactly the right squadron to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. And that made a smaller air force fight like a much bigger one. Then in September, a German bomber crew got lost and accidentally dropped their bombs on London. Britain retaliated on Berlin, and Hitler, furious, switched the whole campaign from attacking airfields to attacking cities. That decision took the pressure off fighter command at the exact moment it was about to break. So the Blitz begins. British cities burn for months. About 40,000 civilians are killed, and the invasion never comes. And now Hitler does the thing that ends him. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, roughly 3 million Axis troops along a front running from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the largest invasion in human history before or since. And at first it worked, spectacularly. Entire Soviet armies encircled and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners at a time. But here's the detail that reframes the entire Eastern Front, and I love this one because it kills the myth completely. The German army was not a machine of tanks and trucks. It ran on horses. Something like 600,000 horses went into the Soviet Union in 1941. Most German infantry divisions walked in on foot, and their supplies came behind them on horse-drawn carts on dirt roads in a country the size of a continent. So when the autumn rain turned those roads into a meter of mud, and then winter arrived and it hit 40 below, the machine wasn't defeated, it just stopped. Meanwhile, something almost unbelievable was happening on the other side. Soviet factories were being physically taken apart and loaded onto trains. Over 1,500 major factories were moved east of the Ural Mountains and rebuilt, some of them producing tanks again within weeks, in a few cases before the roof was finished. Have you ever wondered what total war actually looks like? That's it. It's an entire country picking itself up and carrying itself 1,000 miles east. Then, on the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Japan's reasoning was cold and, on paper, almost logical. They needed oil, the American embargo was strangling them, and they calculated that one devastating blow would make America negotiate rather than fight a long war across an entire ocean. That is the single greatest misreading of a national character in modern history. And then 4 days later, for reasons historians are still arguing about, Hitler declared war on the United States. He didn't have to. No treaty obligated him. He just did it. And at that moment, the war stopped being a series of regional conflicts and became one single war, with the world's largest industrial economy now standing on the other side of it. I have to stop the story here because something else is happening at the same time, and it isn't a battle and it can't be told like one. While all of this was going on, Nazi Germany was carrying out the systematic murder of Europe's Jewish population, not as a side effect of the war, as policy. In January 1942, at a villa beside a lake outside Berlin, senior officials held a conference in the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the logistics of it. 90 minutes over lunch. Minutes were taken. 6 million Jewish people were murdered. Alongside them, Roma and Sinti, disabled people, gay men, political prisoners, Polish civilians, and more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war who were deliberately starved to death. The historian Raoul Hilberg spent decades reconstructing exactly how it was carried out, and what he found wasn't a mob. It was paperwork, train timetables, budget requests. Ordinary clerks doing ordinary administrative work, each one handling a piece small enough to live with. I'm not going to build a clever point out of that. I just don't think you can tell this story honestly and skip past it, or slot it in as one more event between battles. It is the reason the phrase, "never again," exists at all. Okay. 1942 is the year the war turns, and it turns on 3 continents almost at once. In June, in the Pacific, an American code-breaking team led by a man named Joseph Rochefort, working in a windowless basement, half of them in slippers and bathrobes because they'd stopped going home, had partially broken the Japanese naval code. They knew a huge attack was coming at a place the Japanese called AF. They just couldn't prove where AF was, so Rochefort's team ran a trick. They had the base at Midway transmit an uncoded message saying its water purification plant had broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. Got you. At Midway, the American carriers were waiting. In about 6 minutes of dive bombing, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and the heart of its naval air arm. It never recovered. Not once, for the rest of the war. In North Africa, in October, the British finally stopped Rommel at El Alamein, and in the Soviet Union, at a city on the Volga called Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army fought its way into a ruined urban landscape and then got stuck inside it, room by room, floor by floor, for months. And then, in November, the Soviets didn't attack the city at all. They punched through the weaker Allied armies guarding the German flanks and closed a ring around the entire force. 91,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943. Around 5,000 of them ever saw home again. From that point on, the German army in the East never really moved forward again. Now let me tell you about the part of this war that gets the least screen time and did the most work. The historian Richard Overy, in his book Why the Allies Won, makes a case that's very hard to argue with. This war was decided in factories. The United States built something like 300,000 aircraft. It built cargo ships, Liberty ships, on a production line. More than 2,500 of them, at a pace where a pile of steel became a launched ship in a matter of weeks. By 1944, the Allies were outproducing the Axis by margins that make some of the battles look almost decorative. Courage decided who died. Production decided who won. Those are not the same sentence, and I think about that a lot. And then there's the Quiet War, at a country house in England called Bletchley Park. Thousands of people. A great many of them young women, along with mathematicians, chess champions, crossword obsessives, worked on breaking German codes. The Enigma machine was the big one. Here's the fact almost nobody knows. Enigma was not first broken by Britain, it was broken by Poland. A mathematician named Marian Rejewski reconstructed how the machine worked in 1932, 7 years before the war started. And in July 1939, weeks before the invasion, Polish intelligence quietly handed everything they had to Britain and France. Alan Turing built on that work to design a machine, the bomb, that could grind through possible settings mechanically. And the intelligence that came out of it, codenamed Ultra, told the Allies where U-boats were hunting, where armies were moving, and eventually, crucially, whether the Germans believed the biggest lie of the entire war. Which brings us to the 6th of June, 1944. D-Day gets remembered for the beaches, but the reason it worked was a deception. Operation Fortitude built an entire fake army in southeast England aimed at Calais. Inflatable rubber tanks, plywood landing craft, fake radio traffic. And they put Patton in command of it because the Germans were absolutely certain Patton would lead the real invasion. And feeding that lie from the inside was a Spanish double agent named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, who had invented a network of 27 imaginary sub-agents that German intelligence was faithfully paying salaries to. Every single one of them fictional. He was so trusted that even after the Normandy landings had begun, he told Berlin that Normandy was the diversion, and the real attack was still coming at Calais. And they believed him, and held armored divisions in the wrong place for weeks. That man finished the war holding an Iron Cross from Germany and an MBE from Britain. Same guy, same war. 156,000 men landed in Normandy on the first day from around 7,000 ships. And after that, it becomes 11 months of grinding collapse. Paris liberated in August, one last desperate German counterattack through the Ardennes at Christmas, and the Soviets pushing west with an army that by then was enormous, experienced, and very, very angry. On the 30th of April, 1945, Hitler killed himself in a bunker under Berlin while Soviet troops fought through the streets above him. Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, and the war still wasn't over. In the Pacific, every island cost more than the last one. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo killed around 100,000 people in a single night. On the 6th of August, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. On the 9th, a second one on Nagasaki. And on that same day, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria with 1.5 million men. Japan announced its surrender on the 15th of August, 1945. So what did all of it cost? Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. Nobody can give you a precise number, and the fact that we can't is itself part of the horror. The majority were civilians. And here's where most people's mental picture of this war is simply wrong. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million people. China lost somewhere between 15 and 20 million. Roughly 80% of German army combat deaths happened on the Eastern Front. So if your image of this war is mostly beaches in France and fighter planes over England, and mine was for years, the actual center of gravity was somewhere else entirely, in places most of us were never really taught to picture. So what did it change? Look around you. I mean it, actually look. The United Nations exists because of this. The idea that there is such a thing as a crime against humanity and that a government can be put on trial for it exists because of this. That's Nuremberg. The Refugee Convention that still defines who gets asylum, written in 1951, exists because of this. Modern computing walked straight out of Bletchley Park and the wartime ballistics labs. Radar, jet engines, mass-produced antibiotics, the rockets that became the space program. All of it accelerated by this. The European Union began as a deal about coal and steel signed in 1951, and the entire point of it was to tie French and German industry together so tightly that another war between them would be physically impossible to start. But the thing I keep coming back to is what the winners did in 1945, compared to what the winners did in 1918. In 1918, they wrote Versailles. They handed the loser a bill and a guilt clause and walked away. In 1945, they did the opposite. The Marshall Plan poured roughly $13 billion into rebuilding Europe, including the country that started it. Germany and Japan were occupied, restructured, and then deliberately built back into wealthy democracies by the same people they had just spent years trying to destroy. Not out of kindness, out of a very cold, very practical understanding. A humiliated country doesn't stay quiet. It waits. I started this by telling you about a railway carriage, a carriage that carried a surrender in 1918 and then got hauled back into the same forest to carry a revenge in 1940. That carriage doesn't exist anymore. In the final months of the war, it was destroyed on Hitler's orders, specifically so it could never be used to humiliate Germany a third time, which tells you exactly how the man understood history, as a loop. Your turn, my turn, your turn. And for almost all of human history, he would have been right. That was the pattern. Somebody wins, somebody nurses it, somebody comes back for it later. But that's not what happened this time. The loop broke. Not because people suddenly became good, and not because the war ended cleanly, because it didn't. It slid straight into a Cold War that lasted 45 years and came terrifyingly close to being worse. It broke because a handful of exhausted people in 1945 looked at that clearing in the forest and finally understood that you don't end a war by winning it harder. So it turns out that image at the start isn't really the story of this war at all. It's the story of the one before it. The war this one was still finishing. The Second World War is what happened afterward, when somebody finally decided to stop passing the carriage back and forth. Anyway, that's the story. Or honestly, about 1% of it, because you could spend an entire lifetime on any single paragraph I just said, and plenty of people have. Thanks for staying with me this long. I know that was a big one. I'm Chio, and I'll see you in the next one.